Looks like I'm preaching on Exodus today. If you want to open up your Bible to the book of Exodus chapter 17 and be in the scripture reading, I guess that's what we'll talk about. You know, Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, wrote that if you weaken the left, or if you strengthen the left, the right will be weakened. And if you strengthen the right, the left will be weakened. And he also wrote, if you attack the tail, then the head will attack you. But if you attack the head, then the tail will attack you. And if you attack the middle, then the head and the tail will attack you. And this comes from a great Chinese general who didn't just think these up when he was in the shower or in his bed. This comes from experience. This comes from studying. And so a collection of the art of war came from a man that was versed in the art of war. It's not much of a prophecy. It's just wisdom and knowledge written down. When David was giving the Lord's Supper talk this morning, he talked about how the prophecy in Isaiah came to fruition eventually. Something that wasn't studied or unknown or learned through wisdom, but that was given specifically to Isaiah as a revelation for something greater that was going to come later. There's different ways to understand the future, and one of them is through a collection of documents from wisdom that's put together, maybe like Ecclesiastes, the Art of War, something like that. And another is for God to reveal it to you. But then there's another one where we can take something from the past, understand it, and then apply it to something that's happening now, or that might happen in the future, and realize that the past gives us clues about what it's like to conquer the future in general. And I believe this war that's going on between Israel and Amalek, or maybe the Amalekites, is an indication of what it's like to do war with Satan. There's a lot of parallels here. And we'll look at those parallels as we go on. As I had said earlier, if you attack the tail, then the head will attack you. We see that Amalek was the one to attack, but in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17, it specifically says Amalek attacked the rear, which was weak and vulnerable. And yet Israel didn't lose because the front line probably circled around to attack Amalek that was at the rear, and so the head attacked where the tail was being devoured. But maybe we need to know a little bit more about Amalek rather than just a war strategy one time to understand how Amalek is compared to Satan. We'll look at both of these and put them together and realize that we cannot just identify an enemy or how an enemy will attack, but also realize that a battle plan is given for us even in Exodus chapter 17, and a very simple one to follow. But to understand that battle plan, let's continue to understand Amalek. Let's continue to understand Satan. And that way we cannot just identify the enemy, but we can stand against the enemy. And we will have victory over the enemy in Jesus Christ. Back in Exodus chapter 17, at this battle that's going on, we have already understood that Amalek likes to attack where they know their enemy is going to be vulnerable, namely the rear, as Deuteronomy 25:17 explained to us. Deuteronomy 25:17 also explains to us that Amalek does not fear God. And so we have two things there, and that is they know how to attack the vulnerable and they're not afraid to do it for victory, and that they do not care about God whatsoever. And we can further understand this by knowing that Amalek is a descendant of Esau. And Esau, who sold the birthright, God's people should have been descendants of Esau, but they're descendants of his brother Jacob instead, who tricked Esau into selling his birthright, the right to be in the generation of God's people, for a bowl of soup. And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, Esau is described as profane, or ungodly, or unholy even at some times. And his descendants seem to follow because of the decisions that Esau made. Esau had a son who had a concubine, and they had a child together, and that child was Amalek. And so you have generations of wickedness that's taught into other generations of multiple wives, and to not fear God, which started with Esau apparently. And so now you have an entire nation that does not fear God, and just does not fear God only, but is not afraid to attack his people, and not to only attack his people, but to do it when they know that they're vulnerable. And now that this enemy has come against Israel, Israel decides, I guess it's time to fight. Because Israel would have understood their ancestor Esau, and they understand that there's other nations out there that clearly have to have an ancestor and descendants that work against God. And so Israel might have been able to identify who Amalek was and the Amalekites are, but now that they are face to face with them, this is actually the first battle that they will be partaking in the book of Exodus. When Israel left Exodus, that says that they were dressed for battle, they were prepared for battle, but God knew that they could not stand battle. They knew as soon as they saw war, they would run back to Egypt and give up immediately. That was God's words about Israel. And then in Exodus chapter 14, verse 14, when Egypt is coming against Israel, Israel decides, you know what, maybe we should have just stayed in Egypt and not have been our own. In Exodus 14:14, Moses says, be silent, you only need to keep your peace, the Lord will fight for you. And so in that moment, God does fight for them as Israel's delivered free without fighting. But now is the time to fight. Because Amalek has provoked Israel in the middle of the wilderness. And Israel has nowhere to go. And Israel realizes they have nowhere to go because they're complaining to God and they're complaining to Moses in the previous chapters about not having water or bread or water again. And God provides once again. And now that an enemy has come to fight against them, you actually don't hear any complaining against Moses or against God. It seems like this one crisis has brought everybody together. Happens a lot throughout history also. Not only has it brought everybody together, now Joshua is the leader, as Moses has sent him out to pick people to fight, instead of choosing a leader to send them back to Egypt, what they wanted before. And you hear no desire for that either. Because I think Israel finally realizes we're in the wilderness with God alone and there's nowhere to go. And now is the time to get together. And not quarrel, but now is the time to fight the enemy that has come against us. Israel wasn't looking for a fight. Amalek came against Israel. In comparison to Satan, we can clearly understand that Satan is not afraid to attack the vulnerable or the weak. This is just our first of the comparisons that we have here. In fact, as you know, it was Jesus when he was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, which would have been a starving period, that Satan comes to attack him in his weakness and says, if you're really God, just turn the stones to bread. Prove it, Jesus. If you're really the Son of God, you've been out here alone by yourself for over a month now, Jesus. You want some company? Just throw yourself off a cliff and angels will come and attend to you. Satan is not afraid to attack the vulnerable part. He's not going to attack the strong part. He's going to attack the vulnerable part. And that's something that we need to identify. In 1 Peter 5:8, it describes Satan as a lion seeking someone to devour. Satan doesn't need to be provoked. He's on the prowl. He's on the prowl and looking to feast on your weakness. And so the fight is also not optional any more than it was optional for Israel against Amalek at this moment. The fight is necessary. The fight is now against Satan, the one that comes against us, the one that prowls around us, the one that attacks our vulnerabilities. Now is not the time to run away and hide and wait for the battle to be over against Amalek. Now is the time to stand and fight, and to fight together. In the year 400, a list of 10 imperial persecutions was actually drafted on a scroll. This was the time when Rome was adamant about persecuting Christians, starting with a persecution under Nero in 64 to 68 AD, moving to Domitian and then Trajan, and then Marcus Aurelius and Semptus Severus, Maximus the Thracian, Decius, Valerian, Aurelian, and then Diocletian and Galerius kind of got together there and did all of this persecuting. And so you have 10 empirical persecutions, and some of them were immediately one after another, but sometimes you would have about a 20-ish year break, kind of like you get between Nero and Domitian. And other times you might get closer to like a 40-year break. And so if you were under persecution at one time, you might see a little bit of relief, but then it would just come right back with another emperor, another ruler. It was really unstable, much like today's government in the United States. However, a term was developed in these imperial persecutions called lapsy. Lapsy, which, yes, sounds like lapse, like a lapse in judgment, a lapse in faith, was used to describe Christians that decided that when the persecution was too much, they would just give up their faith and they would go and they would worship the emperors. They would worship the gods at that time. And then when the persecution was gone, they would come back out of their lapse, come back out of their idolatrous worship and want to rededicate themselves back to God when it was easy to do so. And this is how now I'm lapsing in thought here, the penance was invented. Because some believed, yes, you can just come right back after you've lapsed and have gone to worship gods, and others believed, no, you got to do some things to earn your way back into faith. And that also could have been avoided if people had just stuck with the faith and fought together in surviving a persecution. You may be familiar with Pliny's Dilemma, a letter written to Trajan. Pliny, the Roman military man, in his letter about the Christians in Bithynia, this is about circa 112 AD, writes this: "Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted I ordered executed, for I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome." The persecution was real, and it was carried out by the government and by the military. And there were those that second, third time, they were willing to go to the death for their faith under persecution. But the letter goes on and says this: "Soon accusations spread, as usually happens because of the proceedings going on, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods, in words dictated by me, offered prayer with an incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ, none of which those who were really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do these, I thought, should be discharged. Others named the informer declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been, but ceased to be, some 3 years before, some many years, and some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ." It's also revealed that sometimes even entire congregations would denounce their faith and disband. The fight was before them, and they were not willing to have it. Some were willing to go and hide, or some were willing to sacrifice to the gods and to the emperor and burn incense, but then wanted to come back when the war was over. If we're going to be soldiers of Christ, standing firm, brave, and true, in the face of persecution, in the face of evil that goes on in all of the world, we have to stand firm at every moment and every time. The fight is now. The fight is in your life. It's in your community. And don't be ignorant of Satan coming against you. In Monterey Peninsula, you are the front line of truth. You are the front line in the fight for truth in this community and also in your life. Satan knows to attack when you're vulnerable, and sometimes you realize your own vulnerabilities and you understand this is a fight that's going to continue on for the rest of my life as long as I am alive and as long as Satan is alive. This will go on and on and on and on. And sometimes you might have become a new Christian at one point and you realize some of the things that I approved of beforehand and didn't regard as sin or as wrong whatsoever, now that I am on the side of Christ, I realize that these things are wrong. And here they are before me again, and I have to face them not as something that's pleasing, but as something that's tempting to draw me away. And that realization causes a war between us and Satan also. You see, Satan will understand what it's like to want to draw you away from Christ, and it's our job to stand firm under Christ and realize that the battle will go on and on and on until there is no war between us and Satan when we truly stand with Christ in a whole different time. In Exodus chapter 17, after this war has been fought, Exodus chapter 17, verse 16, it says this: "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. This was not a one and done battle, unfortunately. It's understood that Amalek is still here, and Amalek will continue to fight against the Lord's people, but that means the Lord's people are still going to be there, and this fight will go on against Amalek. And we understand that God is with us, and Amalek does not fear God, but hates God and creates a community that wars with God constantly. The fight will go on, and in Numbers chapter 14, verse 45, you realize, well, really Numbers chapter 14 as a whole is when Israel is afraid to go to the promised land because they have spied out the land and brought back a bad report, that there's all sorts of enemies there, and they can't win even if God is on their side. And it's Caleb and Joshua that understand, no, God has delivered us. God has given us victory over Amalek before and all our enemies, and he will do the same thing. But the whole congregation at that time decides, we would rather go back to Egypt, and let's choose a leader now that we have come so far to take us back to Egypt, instead go into the promised land that God has promised to give us. And after realizing their sin, and God has said, okay, it's going to be 40 years and the next generation that goes through, that's when people realize, okay, fine, we'll go up and fight. And God says, no, you've already made your choice. Don't go up and fight. And Moses says, why would you go up and fight now that God has told you not to go up and fight? And they go up anyway, and those that decide to go are defeated. They should have known their enemy before and known that God would deliver them later, but they chose not to fight. They chose to cower and then chose to fight at the wrong time. In Judges chapter 6, verse 33, Gideon breaks down Baal's altar and is met with Amalek, plus a host of other nations. And Gideon, the one who seems to be a scared man, is now the one that's willing to fight, even against Amalek. In 2 Samuel 1 through 16, well, let's go to 1 Samuel 15. King Saul is instructed to go to war against Amalek and to destroy the livestock and the whole city and to put the king to death. And instead, King Saul decides, you know what, I'm going to let the king live, the wicked king that does not fear God. I'm going to let him live against God's orders. And I'm going to take their livestock that God hates, and I'm going to sacrifice them to God. And this is ultimately what costs Saul the kingdom. Suddenly it seems like Saul does not fear God, but takes sides with Amalek, the king of Israel's enemy. 2 Samuel 1 through 16 is when Saul is killed by an Amalekite man. And 2 Samuel 8, 11 through 12, David, his successor, defeats Amalek and then brings tribute to God. You see, there will always be an enemy between God and his people. This has given us an understanding with Amalek once again. There will always be an enemy that comes against God and his people, those that don't fear God. It will never stop. And it's never stopped as long as we look through the records of history, from Nero or any other Caesar to Darwin to Friedrich Nietzsche, that would say and declare God is dead, and then would go on to say Christianity is absolutely useless and they're actually a problem to the world. Or how about Julia Sweeney, the actress and the author who wrote God is Not Great, and leaving God, and proclaiming that atheism is much better than being faithful to God. Different generations, different times, but plenty of movements that want to work against God and God's people, whether it be rulers in government, pagans, cults that are interlaced with preferred practice of paganism among the Romans, or even later thinkers, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, Sagan, Dawkins, Sweeney, groups like Freedom from Religion, the LGBTQ community, or different eras, whether it's Enlightenment or whatever it is. We know that these things have always been there. Especially when we look at Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. We know this. We know this. We've always known this. But then it goes on to say, therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand it in the evil day, and have done all to stand firm. Stand firm, therefore, fastening on every part of the armor. You know there's a threat, but you know God has equipped you, and God has prepared you, and God is with you, and God wants to give you victory. In the battle plan of Exodus chapter 17, not only were there people fighting, but there was Moses on the hill. Moses was on the hill with his arms to the heavens. It says when his arms were up, they were given victory, but when his arms got tired, it seemed that Amalek was going to prevail. And so Hur and Aaron went to support Moses by putting a stone under him and lifting up his hands. And there was victory that day. You see, the lifting up of hands is a symbol of prayer. Moses wasn't just standing up there and doing a nice big stretch for a long time. This was probably a long moment of prayer and pleading to God. And also the reason why Moses says in verse 16 of Exodus 17, I had a hand on the throne of the Lord. It's like God was with us and I was communicating with God. In Psalm 28:2, Psalm 63:4, and Psalm 134:2, it talks about lifting your hands up in prayer to God. 1 Kings 8:22, 38, and 54 talk about praying to God with your arms raised high, especially in front of the tabernacle. 1 Timothy 2:8 in the New Testament talks about lifting up holy hands as prayer to God. Seems like Moses was interceding and praying for the victory, pleading with God that day. And when he got tired, he had brothers to help him through it. You see, the war will always be there, but so will be a God that wants to be prayed to. So will be a God that wants to hear our prayer and give us victory. And so will a church be to help us through the temptations that Satan brings us through and the ways that attacks us, no matter what person, what era, what thinker, what generation. There will always be support to win the battle. Unlike Moses, Jesus did not have such support as he was hanging on the cross, but 2 nails to hold up his hands. And no one was there to lift up his body when he began to suffocate and die. He died alone for you and me. But then he ascends to heaven, and in Hebrews chapter 12:2, we see that we have a greater intercessor than Moses on the hill. Looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, for who the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Hebrews 14, verse 6. Excuse me, that's totally wrong. Hebrews 13, verse 6. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear. What can man do to me? We have Jesus to hear our prayer, to speak to the Father in our behalf, and to take us through with him and with the rest of us through whatever temptation Satan comes at us with. In our vulnerability, we need support, we need prayer, and we need each other. And so as the battle is won, Moses builds an altar. We're back in Exodus chapter 17. Exodus 17 verse 14 says this, the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua. This was something that was important to remember. And so God tells Moses to write it down. Write it down in a book. And recite it in the ears of Joshua. Remember what happened this day, but don't only remember that. And what kind of sounds like an oxymoron, what comes next is that I will surely blot out the memory of Amalek from heaven. So how does this work? You want me to write down to remember that we should forget Amalek, right? And the idea is that someday Amalek will not be the enemy anymore. Someday he will be totally gone. The reason we understand that Amalek existed is because of the document that's been written, and now we read it in the Bible. But it might be difficult to find this in some other outside historical support, right? Where was Amalek? What did he look like? Well, we only know because it's been written down that when you're an enemy of the Lord can wipe you away from the face of the earth. And that's something to be remembered. But when you stand on God's side, as it says in verse 15, Moses built an altar and called the name of it, the Lord is my banner. The victory and the one with the banner of victory will be carried on forever, saying, a hand upon the throne of the Lord, and the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. It was normal when people went to war to have a literal banner that had the different names of the gods and the different nations as they marched into war. But instead of a banner that's being waved in the sky, an altar is built to remember what God has done. And the banner, therefore, is going to be in everybody's memory. It's going to be in everybody's lifestyle to remember when we stand under God, he gave us the victory. On September 6th, 1812, Russian Orthodox priests led one of their most holiest icons before the Polish and Russian armies. And the next day, many of them died at the hand of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so this was the last thing that they saw. And although they were under what seemed to be a holy icon and a holy banner, and many of them believed in God, the physical banner had no power. A physical banner will have no power, but when we stand under God, when we stand under the cross, we see that Jesus is our victor. Jesus is the one that has delivered, and that is the one that we proclaim. And so an altar, a memorial, a banner, a way to live is understanding that Christ was lifted up on the cross and we stand under him. The Christ who conquered all. Christ who waves the banner of mercy, the banner of sacrifice, of righteousness, truth, and love. That's the banner we don't stand under. That's the banner we live under. If Christ was our banner, we exemplify this banner in the way that we live, in the way that he has taught us to live, and in the way that we fight in resisting the devil, and working with each other and supporting each other in prayer and being together and resisting the evil that he tries to convince us to succumb to. You can't stand under the banner of God and under the banner of Amalek, though. You can't stand under the banner of God and the banner of Satan. You can't stand under the banner of God and the banner of the world. You can't stand under the banner of God and the banner of relativism. You can only live under the banner of Christ. And so you must choose. Am I going to stand under the banner of things that stand against God, or will I stand under the banner, live under the banner of Christ, who gives me victory over Satan, who teaches me to fight and stand firm when Satan comes against me, and who stands with my brothers and my sisters, who might be vulnerable and weak and exhausted, but we all lift our hands up to God. We all hold each other's hands up to God. That's the banner that you should stand under. When we deny the fact that Satan attacks us, or even deny that there is wrong, or things that are wrong, we give ourselves over to the enemy. We have to know that God and his statutes will be challenged in every generation forever. And when we stand against what is wrong and stand with God together, we will find that victory in Jesus. And that is the greatest victory to be had. It's greater than just one battle and then another battle and then exhaustion and giving up. It is eternally a place to look forward to, where we will eternally live apart from Satan someday when he is wiped away. And so what changes in your day, in your week, and in your schedule all over if you actually have and implement this battle plan against Satan? When you think about, when I come up at this point in my day, in my week, in this situation and in this place, I know that I'm going to be tempted because I'm weak there. What is your battle plan for that moment? And then what would change in your spiritual life and maybe in your life overall if you implemented a battle plan, especially one that involved being vulnerable and available with your brothers and sisters and praying together and thinking, when this comes, I will fight this time. I'm not giving in to the devil. You should be in the habit of praying at the beginning of your day and praying specifically, God, I know, and I think I know when the devil attacks at this moment. Prepare me to stand firm and fight against him. Give me the victory. Give me the supports. And give me the victory over this battle every single time and in every generation. God wants to give you that victory. That is why he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to give us the greatest victory. And he wants you to stand under his banner. You can be washed free of your sin because of the victory that Jesus Christ gave us. And you can live under the banner this morning, and you can find support from all of us this morning. If you feel like your arms are weak, and you're ready to sit down on the battlefield. Let us strengthen you. If there's anything that I can do for you, let it be known while we